From an abandoned barn in the desolate heart of nowhere came a shattered wail. Yet what he discovered inside, bruised, shackled, and whispering his name, would dismantle the very bedrock of his beliefs. What could force a man of the cloth to doubt the sacred altar at which he prayed? And what sort of truth can inflict wounds more profound than any blade? Would you retreat, or would you remain to confront what others have buried? Leave your thoughts in the comments. For more gripping chronicles of quiet heroes and the impossible decisions they face in the wild frontier, subscribe to Mr. KM Stories. Our story opens on a scorching afternoon in the year 1873, as a pastor's journey led him across a boundary he was never meant to cross. The sun was a searing medallion in the immense washed-out sky of 1873, blanketing the desiccated Texas plains in a relentless, shimmering haze. Whirlwinds of dust spiraled languidly across the horizon, a silent testament to the protracted drought that had scorched the earth and frayed every nerve. For Eli Matz, a man of 37 who bore the weathered mantle of a country preacher, the suffocating afternoon was just an outward sign of a famine within his own soul. His sermons, once proclaimed with a passionate certainty that moved entire congregations, now sounded like empty platitudes to his own ears, the holy words themselves disintegrating to ash on his tongue. He was bone-weary, not only from the punishing sun, but from the heft of a faith that had, somewhere on the arid pathways of his life, gone quiet inside him. He longed with a desperate, silent ache for something tangible, something real that could slice through the facade of his practiced piety and stir the dormant pools of his spirit. His boots, caked in fine, reddish dust, made a rhythmic crunch on the parched ground as he walked, not toward the little whitewashed chapel bearing his name, but away from it, drawn to the edges of the settlement. He had no particular place in mind, just a primal urge pulling him toward the silent emptiness, a faint hope that in solitude he might find some semblance of clarity. The air hung thick and motionless, saturated with the aroma of sun-scorched dirt and the distant scent of dying sage. He had been walking for what seemed like an eternity, the heat of physical weight upon him, when a quiet, almost imperceptible noise caught his ear. A soft, guttural sound, carried on the faintest of breezes, seemed to drift from a solitary, dilapidated barn, its timbers twisted and bleached grey from decades of exposure. It was a structure people generally gave a wide berth, rumoured to be the haunt of restless souls, or simply a shelter for wild creatures. And yet, this sound was unmistakably human, laced with a suffering that resonated in the deepest chambers of Eli's own tired spirit. He paused. His pastoral duty to offer aid warred with a crushing weariness that begged him to turn his back, to leave this sorrow for someone else, for anyone else. But the sound continued, rising slightly in volume, a desperate note in the profound silence. Eli's directionless steps now found a somber resolve. He shoved open the groaning, splintered door of the barn, a billow of disturbed dust swirling to greet him. The inside was a chasm of deep shadows, motes of dust dancing in the slivers of light that penetrated the warped planks. The atmosphere within was suffocating, thick with the smell of old hay, rot, and something else, something metallic and sharp. As his eyes gradually adapted to the gloom, he saw her. Annabeth Cole, a woman no more than 29, was crumpled in a heap of straw, her wrists and ankles bound fast with coarse rope. Her dress, once a delicate sky blue, was now shredded and soiled, clinging to her gaunt figure. A dark, spreading blemish, undeniably blood, stained the material of her skirt, radiating from her right thigh. Her hair, the colour of sun-dried wheat, was matted with filth and sweat, stuck to a face twisted in agony. Her eyes, wide and dazed, flickered in his direction, a flash of fear giving way to a fragile, desperate hope. Eli's breath caught in his chest. The scene was a violent tear in the fabric of his quiet, predictable life. He knelt beside her, his hand shaking as he reached out. "Ma'am," he stammered, his voice sounding foreign and strange. Are you badly injured?" Annabeth flinched from his touch, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Her eyes, though clouded by pain, held a sharp, lucid intelligence. She tried to form words, her voice a reedy whisper, barely audible over the frantic drumming of Eli's own heart. "Please, don't lift my skirt." The words were a plea, a fragile defense of modesty against a backdrop of unimaginable violation. But the dark, growing stain on her dress, the sheer amount of blood, spoke a far more urgent truth. It was a wound that demanded immediate care, a life flickering precariously. Eli's mind, typically lost in the labyrinth of theological questions, became terrifyingly razor-sharp. He saw only the blood, the imminent danger of a life draining away. Her whispered request, though it tore at his conscience, was overruled by a primal, instinctual drive to see the injury, to stanch the flow. With a deep sense of trespass, yet compelled by an overwhelming necessity, Eli's fingers, calloused from years of clutching a Bible, cautiously and gently lifted the hem of her blood-soaked skirt. The moment the fabric rose, exposing the pale skin of her upper thigh, Eli Matz felt the final remnants of his faith in mankind, in the inherent goodness of his fellow man, shatter and turn to dust. There, carved into her flesh with a steady hand, a raw, livid wound that pulsed a deep crimson, were words. Not a random gash, not a chaotic injury, but a deliberate, horrifying message etched deep into her skin. Stark and unforgiving were the words, "She saw too much." The cold, methodical inscription was a blow to his core, a betrayal of everything Eli had ever preached from the pulpit. It wasn't merely a wound. It was a statement, a brand of ownership, a monument to a cruelty so profound it defied reason. This was not a random assault. This was calculated, terrifying. The blood, the agony, the terror in Annabeth's eyes, it all merged into a horrific picture that tore away Eli's delusions, leaving him exposed to the raw, festering reality of human evil. His silenced faith didn't just waver. It died a quick, violent death, choked by the sheer malevolence laid bare before him. How could he speak of a merciful God when such malice walked the earth, so brazenly carved into innocent flesh? The righteous fury he had once preached felt like a bitter mockery. But in that moment, as his belief in a divine plan collapsed, something else, something far more powerful and real, began to stir deep inside him. It wasn't a call from the heavens, but a fierce, earthly purpose. The truth of Annabeth's ordeal, the undeniable reality of her suffering, and the horror of what was done to her, ignited a fire in the cinders of his shattered convictions. He was no longer a preacher, adrift and exhausted. He was simply a man confronting an atrocity, with a single clear path ahead. He would not abandon her. He would not look away. He would not offer empty words. He would act. He would tend to her. He would shield her. "We need to get you out of here," Eli said, his voice now steady, stripped of its former fatigue, filled with a newfound resolve that startled even him. He began to painstakingly untie the ropes that bound her. "Hi." Some movements precise despite the tremor in his hands. His gaze, fixed on her face, conveyed a silent vow. He was not a savior, not in the way he once thought he understood the word. He was simply someone who would stay. He would carry her, if necessary, back to his small, plain home, the very place that had been a refuge for his dwindling faith, and would now become a sanctuary for her shattered body and spirit. This was the start of his metamorphosis, the quiet, profound shift from a man who spoke words to a man who would live a truth, no matter how savage, no matter how perilous. He would choose Annabeth's truth, etched in blood and pain, over the comforting falsehoods of his past. Dust motes danced in the thin rays of light that pierced the cabin's single window. illuminating the quiet, relentless work of Eli Matz. Days melted into one another, distinguished only by the movement of the sun and the slow, painstaking mending of Annabeth Cole. Eli moved with a deliberate, almost reverent grace, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he cared for her injuries. He had removed her blood-caked, torn clothing that first night, exposing a tapestry of deep purples and blacks, crisscrossed with angry red slashes, and the chilling, intentional mark of a branding iron. A crudely formed M for Mason Graves, he knew without asking, marred her left shoulder, a stark symbol of the barbarity she had suffered. He began each day by boiling water. Then, with meticulous care, he would clean her wounds. The first few times, Annabeth flinched, a low moan escaping her, but Eli's touch was firm yet light as a feather. His gaze was constant, unflinching, offering not pity, but only a quiet determination. He cleansed the raw flesh, applied poultices made from herbs he gathered in the nearby woods, and rewrapped her in clean bandages, his fingers brushing her skin. Each touch was a silent recognition of her agony and his own commitment. He prepared simple, nourishing broths, spooning them to her when she was too weak to hold the bowl, and watched as the tremors in her hand gradually lessened. At night, he would take a seat by her makeshift bed, a worn blanket over his shoulders, and listen to her uneven breathing, to the occasional whimper that broke through as nightmares tormented her sleep. He was a silent watchman, a guardian against the lingering ghosts of her ordeal. Annabeth, who was at first a hollowed-out version of a woman, barely conscious, began to emerge from the fog. Her eyes, once clouded with suffering and dread, started to show a spark of awareness, which then grew into a weary curiosity. She watched Eli, her gaze tracing his path as he tended the fire, tidied the cabin, or simply sat, lost in his own thoughts. The silence between them was not vacant. It was a canvas on which their shared ordeal was being rendered, heavy with unspoken questions and a fragile, emerging trust. One afternoon, as Eli was changing her bandages, his fingers tracing the outline of the M on her shoulder, Annabeth's voice, hoarse from disuse, shattered the quiet. "They wanted me to forget." Eli stopped, his eyes locking with hers. He waited. "I saw them," she went on, her voice gathering a delicate strength. "Mason Graves and his men. They were changing the land deeds, cheating people, forging signatures. I saw the real documents, and I heard them, talking about old Mr. Abernathy, how they took his ranch. He just died. They claimed it was suicide, but I heard them laughing about it. They murdered him." Her voice caught, a shudder of revulsion crossing her face. "They saw me. Mason. He said I knew too much. He kept asking me who else knew, who I'd told. I hadn't told a soul. They just kept asking, again and again. They would have killed me. Clyde was about to, but He said Mason wanted to make an example of me. They wanted to be sure I'd never talk again, that I'd never forget who did it, who they were." She trailed off, her gaze fixed on the far wall, trapped in the memory of her terror. "If you hadn't come, I would have been just another meal for the coyotes." Eli simply nodded, his face grim. He didn't offer empty comforts or false promises. He just listened, taking in her words, the truth of her ordeal sinking deep into his bones. The world outside, the one where he had preached about a faraway God, felt impossibly distant, inconsequential. Here, in this small, remote cabin, God was in the quiet act of healing, in the steady rhythm of a life being brought back from the brink. The days continued their slow march, each one returning a little more strength to Annabeth, a little more colour to her skin. She began to move around the cabin, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The silence between them, once burdened by pain, started to feel lighter, filled now with the quiet cadence of two lives becoming intertwined, a shared history in the making. There was an unspoken connection that went beyond words, a bond forged in the crucible of terror and rescue. Annabeth saw in Eli not a savior, but a man who simply stayed, and Eli, in turn, saw in Annabeth a truth that resonated more deeply than any sermon he had ever preached. One late afternoon, as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the small room in shades of orange and violet, Annabeth stood by the cast-iron stove, stirring a pot of stew. Her movements, still a bit stiff, were now fluid, a stark contrast to the broken woman Eli had found. Eli sat at the small wooden table, cleaning the barrel of his rifle, the familiar smell of oil and steel hanging in the air. The silence stretched between them, comfortable now, alive with the pop and crackle of the fire and the gentle simmering of the stew. Annabeth turned, a faint plume of steam rising from the pot. Her eyes, no longer haunted, met Eli's across the room. There was a directness in her gaze that made his breath catch. He felt a change within himself, a subtle tremor that had nothing to do with fear and every toes, to do with a growing feeling he had not yet dared to acknowledge. "Is it hard to focus?" she asked, her voice soft, barely a whisper, yet it sliced through the quiet like a knife. Her eyes stayed on his, a knowing glimmer within their depths. Eli's hand froze on the rifle. The question hung in the air, weighted not with curiosity about his task, but about the unspoken energy that hummed between them. He looked at her, truly looked at her, at the faint scars that still traced her skin, at the resilience that had returned to her eyes, at the undeniable magnetism he felt. The words of his old life, the sermons, the scriptures, the promises of a distant salvation felt like hollow echoes, devoid of meaning. All that mattered was this moment, the truth of this woman standing before him. "You make it seem easy to forget everything else," Eli answered, his voice rougher than he'd intended, raw with an honesty he had long held back. He set the rifle down, the click of metal on wood echoing in the quiet room. He rose from his chair, slowly and deliberately, his gaze never leaving hers. The masks he had worn for so long, the devout pastor, the man of God, crumbled away, turning to dust. What was left was simply Eli, stripped bare, exposed. He walked toward her, the few steps across the small room feeling like a journey of 1,000 miles. The air grew thick with unspoken yearning, with the shared weight of their pasts, and the undeniable promise of a future that was just beginning to materialize. He reached her, his hand gently lifting to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing against the faint scar near her temple. In her eyes, he saw not a victim, but a survivor, a woman who had rescued him from the ruins of his own self-deceit. This was his truth now, this tangible connection, this raw, undeniable pull. His old life, his old faith was gone, replaced by the fierce, quiet certainty that Annabeth Cole was his new beginning. The fragile peace that had enveloped the small cabin on the isolated plains was a fleeting calm, a breath held before the inevitable storm. For weeks, Eli Matz and Annabeth Cole had carved out a life from the dust and silence, their shared trauma forming a strange, unbreakable bond. Eli, no longer a preacher constrained by words he didn't believe, had discovered a new, terrifying truth in Annabeth's eyes. He had chosen her reality, and with it a path he could never have foreseen. Annabeth, her body a map of scars from a past she couldn't escape, had found in Eli not a rescuer, but someone who simply remained, a quiet anchor in her turbulent world. But the quiet was about to be torn apart. A distant rumble, faint at first, swelled into the thunder of approaching hooves, ripping through the stillness of midday. A cloud of dust, thick and foreboding, rose on the horizon, drawing a grim line against the vast blue canvas of the sky. 3 figures materialized from the swirling haze, riding hard, their forms growing larger with each pounding beat of the earth. Clyde, impulsive and quick on the draw, spurred his horse onward. Beside him rode Ree, a lean, observant man, and a third burly rider whose face was a mask of grim resolve. They were the dogs Mason Graves had set loose, though the cruel, calculating leader himself was not among them, his malevolent purpose echoing in their every move. Graves knew that fear was the most direct path to silence, and he intended to silence Annabeth permanently. Their shouts, coarse and dripping with menace, rode the wind long before their faces came into view. "Annabeth Cole! We know you're in there! Mason wants his due!" Clyde's voice, raw and grating, tore through the air like a declaration of war. Eli Matz, a man remade, stood on the cabin's small porch. The weathered rifle, once a tool for putting food on the table, felt impossibly light in his grasp. His heart, against all reason, was steady, a placid lake in the face of the oncoming tempest. The man who had once delivered sermons on forgiveness and grace was gone, supplanted by a resolve as hard and unforgiving as the plains themselves. This wasn't about saving souls. This was about defending the only truth he had left. Annabeth appeared at his side, a silent, powerful presence. Her movements were fluid, free of any hesitation. In her hand, she held a glint of polished steel, her hunting knife, honed to a razor's edge. Her eyes, once haunted, now burned with a cold, sharp fire. It was the look of someone who had journeyed through the deepest circle of hell and emerged, not unscarred, but unbroken. She was not afraid. She was prepared. She had stared down worse than these men, and she would do so again. The first shot rang out, a reckless warning from Clyde's pistol that kicked up dust by Eli's feet. It was a fatal error. Eli's reaction was instantaneous, an instinct born of necessity, not practice. The rifle barked, a sharp, deafening crack that split the air. Clyde, still mounted on his charging horse, jolted violently, his body thrown back as if yanked by an unseen force. He toppled from the saddle, landing with a sickening thud, his momentum carrying him in a short, graceless skid, before he lay motionless, a rapidly spreading dark patch blooming on his chest. The first wolf had been put down. Ree, witnessing Clyde's fall, swerved sharply, abandoning the frontal assault. He spurred his horse around the cabin, making for the less exposed rear entrance in a desperate flanking attempt. He was fast, but Annabeth was faster. She moved like a phantom, slipping from the porch, her bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. She knew every inch of this land, every hiding place, every blind spot. She was waiting, a predator in her own domain. Henri dismounted, his boots landing with a soft crunch. He barely had time to see the dark form that emerged from the cabin's shadow. Annabeth was on him in a flash, her knife a silver arc in the sunlight. Ree gasped, a choked, gurgling cry as the blade sank deep into his throat. His hands flew up, clawing feebly at the handle, his eyes wide with a terror that lasted only a few agonizing heartbeats before he crumpled forward, his lifeblood seeping into the dry ground. The third man, seeing the swift, savage end of his comrades, let out a roar of primal fury. He leaped from his horse, charging Eli with a guttural scream in a desperate, animalistic attack. He was a giant of a man, powered by rage and a raw need for revenge. Eli met him on the ground, dropping the rifle, knowing this fight had moved beyond bullets. The man lunged, a wild swing aimed for Eli's head. Eli ducked under it, the blow whistling past his ear, and countered with a hard, sharp jab to the man's midsection. It barely staggered the brute. The fight became a brutal, visceral dance of fists and grunts. They grappled, locked in a desperate embrace, dust churning in a cloud around them. The man was stronger, but Eli was quicker, driven by a cold, unbending will. He took a punch to the jaw that sent stars across his vision but didn't break him. He saw his chance, a brief moment of vulnerability in the man's eyes as he wound up for another crushing blow. Eli lunged inside the man's reach, grabbing his head with both hands. With a savage, guttural roar that sounded alien even to himself, Eli twisted, pouring every ounce of his transformed being into the motion. A sickening crack echoed, followed by a wet, tearing sound. Eli didn't release his grip. He kept twisting, kept pushing, his knuckles grinding against bone until the man's struggles ceased, his body going limp. Eli didn't stop until the face was a pulpy, unrecognizable ruin, until the silence was total and absolute. He stood over the fallen man, breathing hard, his chest heaving. And his eyes were clear, empty of remorse. The preacher was well and truly dead. Annabeth emerged from the shadows at the back of the cabin, her knife still in her hand, a single drop of blood tracing a line down the polished blade. Her gaze met Eli's, and a silent understanding passed between them. No words were necessary. They had faced the wolves, and in doing so had become something else entirely, something harder, something more ruthless, forged in the fires of their shared ordeal. The peace was still fragile, but it was their own, defended with blood and an unwavering resolve. The silence that fell was heavy, broken only by the wind, which carried away the dust and the echoes of violence. The ground was littered with bodies, a grim monument to the new, terrifying nature of Eli Matz and Annabeth Cole. They had survived. And in surviving, they had been irrevocably changed. The moon, a sliver of bone against the vast, inky canvas of the night, offered little light as Eli and Annabeth toiled. The ground, hard and resistant, gave way slowly to the bite of their shovels. Each scoop of earth, each dull thud as it landed beside the deepening pit, was a punctuation mark to the brutal reality of the day. The air, still heavy with the lingering smell of gunpowder and dread, felt oppressive bearing down on them. They worked in a somber, silent rhythm, the only sounds the scrape of steel on dirt and their own ragged breaths. First they moved Clyde, his body surprisingly light, yet weighted with the violence he had personified. Eli grunted with the effort. Annabeth, despite her smaller build, was his equal, a steady, unyielding partner. Her movements were efficient, free of hesitation, a stark contrast to the tremors that still occasionally shook Eli's hands. There was no pity in her eyes, only a grim resolve to see this through to the end. Next came Ree, his throat a gaping, silent indictment in the stillness of the night. Burying him was a further affirmation of Annabeth's desperate, efficient ferocity, a truth Eli had witnessed and now helped to conceal. Finally, the third man, the last of Mason Graves's enforcers, his face frozen in a rictus of surprise and agony, was lowered into the cold embrace of the earth. Eli felt no sense of victory, only a profound exhaustion, a deep-seated ache that went far beyond physical strain. The act of burying these men, these ghosts of a life they had been forced to confront, was a final, chilling ceremony. They weren't seeking justice, but obliteration, a burial not just of bodies, but of the very idea that their lives could ever go back to what they were. Each shovelful of dirt thrown over the shallow graves felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of their past selves. Hours later, as the first faint blush of dawn began to stain the eastern horizon, they stood over the freshly turned soil, 3 indistinguishable mounds on the dark landscape. Eli swiped sweat from his brow with a dirty hand, his gaze falling on the church, a silent sentinel in the distance. Its steeple, once a beacon of spiritual comfort, now seemed like a monument to a hollow lie, a life he had worn like an ill-fitting coat. He had stood in that pulpit day after day, year after year, speaking words he thought he believed, yet always keeping a part of himself guarded, unexamined. The man who had preached sermons on mercy and divine providence could not be reconciled with the man who had just dug graves for his enemies, a man whose hands still felt the shadow of violence. His faith, a foundation laid deep in his soul, had not vanished. It was not God he had forsaken, but the performance, the facade of a man untouched by the savage truths of the world. He had seen Annabeth's scars, felt the raw edge of her pain, witnessed the depths of human cruelty and the fierce, unbreakable Wafihi. Ill to leave, he had confronted his own capacity for decisive, brutal action, for standing firm against evil. He was no longer just Eli Matz, the preacher. He was Eli, a man of flesh and blood and truth, irrevocably altered, stripped bare of the comfortable deceptions he once told himself. The words of his old sermons, once a source of strength, now felt like ash in his mouth. He could not go back to that pulpit, could not stand before his flock, and speak of peace when his hands remembered the weight of a shovel burying the dead, when his eyes had seen the truth in a woman's unwavering resolve. Inside the small, sparsely furnished house, the silence was thick, broken only by the soft rustle of cloth as they gathered their few possessions. A single satchel for Eli, a small canvas bag for Annabeth, a few changes of clothing, a blanket, some jerky and hardtack. Practical necessities, stripped of all sentiment. The few items that remained in the house felt like relics from another life, a life that no longer belonged to them. Annabeth moved with an unnerving purpose, her gaze sharp and appraising. She picked up a small, chipped porcelain doll from a dusty shelf, a memento from a simpler time. Her fingers brushed its painted face for a beat, a fleeting, unreadable emotion in her eyes, before she set it back down, leaving it behind. The past, she knew, was an anchor, not a guide. Just as the first slivers of golden light began to cut through the darkness, painting the sky in hues of rose and violet, they stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pines. The world was stirring, unaware of the profound transformation that had taken place within these two souls. Eli pulled the door closed behind them, the soft click echoing with the finality of a story's end. He did not glance back at the small house that had been his refuge, his prison, and his battlefield. His eyes were fixed forward on the dusty track that stretched out before them, an unmarked road into an unknown future. There was no hesitation in his step, only a quiet, steady determination. Annabeth, however, paused at the edge of the porch, her eyes sweeping over the landscape one last time. She looked at the house, a testament to the horror she had survived and the desperate battle she had won. She looked at the faint, disturbed earth where her tormentors lay buried, a silent promise of silence kept. Her gaze drifted to the distant steeple, etched sharp against the brightening sky, a symbol of a world that had never truly been hers, a world that had offered her no safety until Eli had shattered its rules. It was a silent goodbye, not of regret, but of release. A final, internal acknowledgement of the woman she had been and the woman she had now become. The scars on her skin, once a brand of their cruelty, now felt like a map of her own strength, a testament to her survival. She turned, her shoulders set, and followed Eli. They walked away from the church, away from the town, away from the shadows that had clung to them like a shroud. The road was a ribbon of red dust under the nascent light, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The vast, untamed expanse of 1873 America opened before them, offering anonymity and infinite possibilities. They carried no heavy burdens, no expectations, only the raw, visceral truth of who they now were. Eli, the preacher who had found his true sermon in action, and Annabeth, the survivor who had found an unlikely ally, not in salvation, but in shared defiance. Their steps were measured, synchronized, two solitary figures against the immense canvas of the West. The past was buried, the church abandoned, and the only certainty was the endless road ahead, a path forged in blood and quiet resolve, leading them into a new, uncertain dawn. They were free, unbound by the roles they once played, now simply two people, forging a destiny born of fire and truth. As the dust settles on this chapter, the profound silence left in its wake is not the silence of fear that Mason Graves sought to create. but a deeper quiet, born of unwavering conviction. It serves as a reminder that some truths are too heavy for words. Truths that must be defended not with sermons or pleas, but with the stark, unyielding presence of resolve. Ely Matz, the preacher tired of his own voice, discovered his truest calling in the refusal to allow Annabeth's scarred flesh to become a tombstone for her story. It was a testament to the idea that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to stay, to bear witness, and to choose courage over the comfortable mirage of peace. Their journey through the severe beauty of the Old West whispers a timeless question. What is the true price of silence? And what transformations must we endure to finally stand for a difficult truth? This story leaves us to contemplate the weight of unspoken knowledge and the profound change one person can make by choosing to abandon the familiar for the sake of another's essential reality. We want to hear what resonated most deeply with you in this tale. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What does it truly mean to break a silence, not with words, but with action? And if this journey into the heart of courage and conviction stirred something inside you, consider subscribing for more explorations into the shadows and light of the human spirit.